This is True Crime Stories for Sleep. When people talk about some of the most unsettling criminal cases in American history, the name Dennis Rader, better known as the BTK Killer, inevitably surfaces. For 3 decades, Rader lived what many believed to be an ordinary, respectable life in Wichita, Kansas. He was a church leader, a compliance officer, a family man. But beneath the surface, he led a double existence that would shock the world when his secret finally came to light. Between 1974 and 1991, Rader murdered 10 people, taunting both law enforcement and the media with cryptic letters in which he signed himself. BTK, short for bind, torture, kill, a chilling description of his preferred method of control. Before we dive into his life and the disturbing events that unfolded, I want to take a quick moment to welcome you into this community. If you enjoy deep, detailed true crime explorations like this, consider subscribing, liking this video, and leaving a comment to let me know where you're listening from and who you'd like me to cover next. I read every single comment, and your support truly helps me continue creating thoughtful, respectful, and in-depth content like this. Now, let's step into the story of Dennis Rader, the seemingly ordinary man who concealed an extraordinary darkness. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, to William and Dorothea Rader. He was the oldest of 4 brothers, and on the surface, his early life seemed relatively stable. The family moved to Wichita while Rader was still young, where his father took a demanding job as a plant manager at a local utility company. Friends and neighbors described the Rader household as modest but disciplined, with strong expectations placed on the children. However, Rader later described a childhood that felt emotionally cold and distant. He claimed that his parents were busy and often inattentive, which he believed contributed to a growing sense of isolation. Over time, this loneliness began to foster a deep, hidden inner world. From an early age, Rader exhibited troubling behavior. He developed what he later called dark fantasies, involving control, bondage, and power. He would secretly bind small animals, fascinated by the sense of dominance. These urges remained hidden, compartmentalized beneath the image of a quiet, obedient boy. Rader attended Riverview Elementary School, and while he wasn't particularly outgoing, teachers found him polite and unremarkable. Yet, there were early warning signs of a growing obsession with control. In later confessions, Rader admitted that even as a child, he fantasized about trapping and restraining people, ideas that became more vivid and structured as he grew older. By the time Rader reached adolescence, his need for secrecy became part of his identity. He began collecting magazines and images depicting bondage, hiding them carefully from his family. These fantasies didn't dissipate with age, they deepened, taking root in ways that would later shape his crimes. But outwardly, Rader maintained the appearance of normalcy, blending into his community with ease. After high school, Rader attended Kansas Wesleyan University for a short time but struggled academically. In 1966, he decided to enlist in the U.S. Air Force, a choice that gave him structure, discipline, and a sense of belonging he had lacked in his childhood. For 4 years, he served in postings across the U.S. and overseas, including tours in Okinawa, South Korea, and Greece. While his service record was respectable, those close to him noticed he remained unusually private and guarded. Upon returning to Kansas in 1970, Rader attempted to integrate back into civilian life. He found work at a local supermarket, and it was there that he met Paula Dietz, a soft-spoken woman who would later become his wife. They married in 1971 and settled in Park City, a suburb of Wichita. Together, they built what appeared to be a stable, middle-class life. They attended church regularly, participated in community events, and over time, had 2 children. By all outward appearances, Rader seemed like the model citizen. He worked multiple jobs, including a position with ADT Security installing home alarm systems, a role that would later give him intimate knowledge of his victims' homes and routines. He was deeply involved in his local church, eventually becoming president of its council. Neighbors described him as quiet but polite, though some found him rigid and overly focused on rules. But behind the carefully constructed facade, Rader's violent fantasies had not subsided. In fact, they intensified. The contrast between his public image and private desires became a defining feature of his life, a duality he nurtured, keeping his darker urges compartmentalized from his family and community. By the early 1970s, these fantasies had reached a breaking point, and Rader decided to act on them. In January 1974, Dennis Rader committed his first known murders, the Otero family killings. On the morning of January 15th, Rader broke into the Wichita home of Joseph and Julie Otero, intending to subdue the family and live out his long-nurtured fantasies. What unfolded was far more violent and chaotic than he had planned. Rader bound and murdered Joseph and Julie, along with two of their children, Joseph Jr. and Josephine. The killings shocked the community and left investigators scrambling for answers. After the murders, Rader returned to his quiet domestic life as though nothing had happened. But inside, he felt emboldened. The Otero case gave him a sense of control and validation over the fantasies he had nurtured for so long. It was also the moment when Dennis Rader began to shape the persona that would make him infamous, the BTK Killer. Later that year, Rader anonymously contacted local media and police to claim responsibility for the Otero murders. He included disturbing details only the killer could know and signed his letter, BTK, standing for bind, torture, kill. This signature would haunt Wichita for decades. Rader craved recognition for his crimes but also relished the cat-and-mouse game with authorities, feeding his need for control and power. The city of Wichita, once considered a quiet and safe community, now lived under a shadow of fear. Residents locked their doors, bought security systems, and altered their routines, terrified that the BTK Killer might strike again. Law enforcement launched one of the largest manhunts in Kansas history, but Rader managed to stay steps ahead, hiding behind the mask of his seemingly ordinary life. This dual existence, family man, church leader, and serial killer, defined Dennis Rader's life during the 1970s. His ability to compartmentalize so completely allowed him to evade suspicion for years. He built a respectable reputation, all while continuing to fantasize, plan, and refine his methods in secret. After the brutal murders of the Otero family in January 1974, Wichita was consumed by fear. 4 innocent lives had been taken inside their own home, and police had no solid leads. The community tightened its routines, double-locked doors, and whispered constantly about the possibility of a killer lurking in their neighborhoods. While law enforcement scrambled, Dennis Rader returned quietly to his ordinary life, attending church with his wife Paula, working diligently for ADT security, and blending into the fabric of suburban Kansas. But inside, something had been awakened in him, something that would not rest. The Otero murders had given Rader an intoxicating sense of control, and the fantasy world he had nurtured for years now demanded more. Just 3 months later, on April 4, 1974, Rader acted again. His target was Catherine Bright, a 21-year-old Wichita State University student. He had stalked her carefully, breaking into her home before she returned. When Catherine and her brother Kevin entered, they were ambushed. Rader pulled a gun, pretending he needed money and a car. He tied them both up, planning to methodically execute what he later described as Phase 2 of his BTK plan. But this time, things didn't go smoothly. Kevin managed to free himself and fought back, forcing Rader into a violent struggle. In the chaos, Rader shot Kevin twice in the head, believing he had killed him, but Kevin miraculously survived. With Kevin gone, Rader turned on Catherine, stabbing her repeatedly before fleeing the scene. For the first time, Rader had left a living witness. Kevin provided police with a general description: a white male in his 20s, around 5 feet 10 inches, with dark hair. Investigators finally had something concrete, but the lead still wasn't enough to point them toward Rader, who returned home shaken but also exhilarated. He later admitted that this attack nearly spiraled out of control, making him more cautious and meticulous moving forward. After Catherine Bright's death, Rader entered a period of silence. Wichita detectives were consumed by 2 connected murders, the Oteros and Bright. But with no forensic evidence and no viable suspects, they hit wall after wall. For Rader, the pause was strategic. He understood that killing again too soon would be dangerous, but the fantasies gnawed at him constantly. He began keeping notebooks he called his projects, meticulously documenting potential victims, stalking habits, home layouts, and escape routes. He referred to these women as projects rather than people, reducing them to entries in a catalog of control and domination. By October of 1974, Rader's craving for recognition became too strong to contain. He placed a letter inside an engineering book at the Wichita Public Library, addressed to the Wichita Eagle. Inside, he confessed to the Otero murders in chilling detail, details only the killer could have known. It was in this letter that he first introduced the moniker BTK, standing for Bind, Torture, Kill. He wrote about his compulsion and his inability to stop, signing off with his new identity as if christening a separate persona. The revelation shocked Wichita. Residents who had been clinging to the hope that the Otero murders were an isolated tragedy were now faced with the horrifying reality that a serial killer was in their midst. The letter escalated fear across the city. Security system sales soared, neighborhood watch programs formed overnight, and families who once left doors unlocked began bolting them shut at all times. But for Rader, the attention was exactly what he wanted. He began cutting out newspaper articles about BTK and savoring the growing tension in Wichita, taking pride in the panic his letter had sparked. After this, Rader stayed quiet for nearly 3 years, all while his fantasies intensified. During this time, he continued living his carefully crafted double life, installing home security systems for ADT, becoming an active member of Christ Lutheran Church, and even starting a family. To those around him, Dennis Rader was an unremarkable, mild-mannered suburban father. Inside, however, his private world of obsession deepened, and in early 1977, BTK resurfaced. On March 17, 1977, Rader targeted Shirley Vian, a 24-year-old mother of 3. He had been following her, studying her home and routines, and decided the time was right. Breaking into her house, Rader encountered Shirley's children and locked them in a bathroom to prevent interference. He then strangled Shirley to death and left without harming the children. The surviving kids provided a rough description of the man who had killed their mother, but once again, Rader slipped through the cracks. This murder demonstrated his growing confidence and his ability to operate methodically without leaving incriminating evidence behind. 3 months later, on December 8, 1977, Rader struck again. This time, his victim was Nancy Fox, a 25-year-old woman who lived alone. Unlike his previous murders, Rader escalated his interaction with law enforcement after this killing. After strangling Nancy in her home, he called the police himself, calmly reporting the crime and giving her name and address before hanging up. The call was traced to a payphone, but there were no witnesses. For Wichita detectives, this brazen act confirmed their worst fears. BTK was no longer content to simply kill in secret. He wanted everyone to know he was out there. By now, Rader had killed 7 people. Each crime increased his need for validation, feeding the persona he had constructed around BTK. He studied his victims extensively, planned every move, and documented each detail for his personal archives. These journals contained sketches, photographs, and step-by-step accounts of his attacks, all organized meticulously as if he were curating his own private museum of terror. In early 1978, Rader decided to directly taunt authorities and the media again. He sent a letter to Cake TV in Wichita, comparing himself to other infamous serial killers such as Ted Bundy and David Berkowitz, the son of Sam. In the letter, he demanded that his crimes be acknowledged and his chosen identity, BTK, be used publicly. He craved the fame and notoriety he felt he deserved, frustrated that other killers were receiving more recognition. "How many do I have to kill?" he wrote, "before I get my name in the paper or some national recognition?" Despite his increasingly bold communications, Rader remained undetected. Police compiled hundreds of potential suspects, cross-referenced lists of ADT employees, church members, and gun owners, and even considered the possibility of multiple killers working together. But Rader's outwardly normal life shielded him from suspicion. He was the embodiment of the killer next door archetype: ordinary, polite, and invisible. After 1978, BTK suddenly disappeared from the public eye. Wichita cautiously began to exhale, believing the nightmare might be over. Rader entered what investigators would later call his cooling-off period, focusing on his family, his church, and his job. But privately, his fantasies never stopped. He collected clippings of his old letters, revisited photographs of his victims, and continued building his detailed hit kits, bags filled with tools he used to stalk, restrain, and kill. The stillness was deceptive. Rader wasn't gone. He was waiting, calculating, and preparing for the next phase. By the end of the 1970s, Dennis Rader had committed 7 murders, terrorized an entire city, and built a psychological game between himself and law enforcement. Wichita remained haunted by BTK's shadow, living with the constant fear that he could strike again at any moment. But as the city began to settle into an uneasy calm, Rader was evolving. His methods, his fantasies, and his hunger for recognition were growing more complex. He wasn't finished, and his next steps would push him even closer to exposure. After the chaos of the 1970s, Wichita slipped into a fragile sense of calm. The community was still haunted by the name BTK, a faceless predator who had stalked, bound, tortured, and killed 7 people. But as the years passed, the headlines faded. The Wichita Police Department was under tremendous pressure to solve the case, but leads had dried up, witnesses had scattered, and evidence remained frustratingly inconclusive. By the early 1980s, many began to wonder if BTK had died, been arrested elsewhere, or simply vanished forever. But Dennis Rader was still there, living quietly in Park City, Kansas, just a few miles from the heart of Wichita. Outwardly, his life looked completely ordinary. He had been married to Paula Dietz since 1971, and together they were raising 2 children, a son and a daughter. He became more involved in his local church, Christ Lutheran, where he served as council president and maintained an image of being a responsible, devout member of the community. He also worked full-time for ADT Security Services, installing alarm systems for homeowners worried about intruders, a bitter irony, given that one of Wichita's most feared intruders was the man installing their locks. Despite this surface-level normalcy, Rader's fantasies hadn't gone dormant. He was obsessed with control, manipulation, and domination, and those compulsions didn't simply vanish because he had stopped killing. If anything, his long silence intensified his inner desires. He kept extensive journals, writing down what he called projects, tracking potential victims, and outlining detailed scenarios in which he imagined carrying out his attacks. These notebooks were highly organized, filled with maps, sketches, and coded references only he understood. The man who blended so seamlessly into suburban life was secretly feeding his compulsions behind closed doors. In 1985, after nearly 8 years of inactivity, Rader struck again. His target was Maureen Hedge, a 53-year-old neighbor who lived just a few houses away from his own home. This proximity to his victim shows how his confidence had grown since his earlier murders. On the night of April 27th, Rader attended a church event with his wife and other parishioners. Afterward, he made an excuse to leave early, telling Paula he was tired and going home to rest. Instead, he parked his car near a bowling alley, staged the scene to look as if he had been drinking, and walked several blocks back toward Hedge's house, dressed in dark clothing and gloves. Breaking into her home, Rader lay in wait. When Maureen returned late that evening, he ambushed her, strangling her to death. But this killing was different from the others. Instead of leaving her at the scene, Rader took her body with him. He drove her remains to Christ Lutheran Church, the very same place where he served as council president, and posed her body for photographs using ropes and props he had prepared in advance. This ritualistic behavior revealed a disturbing evolution in his crimes. The murder itself was no longer enough. He needed to create, control, and preserve the imagery for his own gratification. Afterward, he returned Maureen's body to a rural ditch before heading home as though nothing had happened. Investigators were baffled when they discovered her body days later. The level of planning suggested a meticulous killer, but by now BTK hadn't been heard from publicly in years. The Wichita Police Department refused to confirm publicly whether they believed this was connected to the earlier murders. They were cautious not to provoke BTK into writing again, knowing how much he thrived on attention. In the years that followed, Rader kept up his double life. He was promoted at ADT and became known among coworkers as a disciplined, detail-oriented employee, though some quietly described him as controlling and arrogant. His involvement at the church grew, and he also became active in Park City's local government, eventually securing a position as a compliance officer. In this role, he enforced city ordinances, handing out citations for overgrown lawns and improperly placed trash bins. Residents would later recall how Rader relished this small taste of authority, intimidating neighbors and lecturing them over minor violations. This position fed the same hunger for power and control that fueled his crimes. Then, in September 1986, Rader struck again. His victim was Vicky Wego, a 28-year-old mother of two. He posed as a telephone repairman to gain access to her home, carrying a briefcase filled with tools, bindings, and weapons. Once inside, he attacked her, strangling her and stealing her driver's license before leaving the scene. That driver's license, along with other personal belongings, would later be discovered in Rader's stash when he was finally caught. At the time, though, investigators had no idea BTK had returned. The crime scene lacked his signature communication, and the evidence didn't match earlier murders conclusively. Following Vicky's death, Rader went silent once again. By now, it had been over a decade since he first announced himself to Wichita as BTK, and authorities remained at a standstill. Advances in forensic technology were beginning to shape investigations in the late 1980s, but DNA profiling was still in its infancy, and without new letters or clear connections between the killings, the case gradually went cold. But Rader's inner world didn't grow quiet. He continued to stalk potential victims, storing detailed notes and photographs in what he called his mother lode collection. In this secret stash, he documented everything from newspaper clippings about BTK to images he had drawn of his imagined scenarios. He developed complex narratives in his mind, creating alter egos and personas that allowed him to justify his actions while keeping his everyday identity untouched. This compartmentalization, the ability to live two entirely separate lives, remains one of the most chilling aspects of Rader's psychology. By the early 1990s, Dennis Rader had killed 10 known victims and had constructed a carefully managed facade as a family man, church leader, and community figure. On the surface, he was respectable and composed. Beneath it, he was meticulously curating the BTK persona, feeding his fantasies while remaining hidden in plain sight. Wichita, meanwhile, had largely moved on, comforted by the belief that BTK had vanished for good. But Dennis Rader had other plans. After years of silence, he would eventually resurface, reigniting fear across the city and taunting police and reporters once again. It was this craving for recognition and control that would lead directly to his capture. But that part of the story was still to come. For now, Rader remained invisible, quietly waiting, his hunger undiminished and his confidence stronger than ever. By the early 1990s, Wichita had settled into a strange sense of security. More than 15 years had passed since the city had been terrorized by the unknown killer who had dubbed himself BTK, and many people began to believe he was either dead, imprisoned on unrelated charges, or had simply stopped altogether. The case was still open, but police had little to go on, and without fresh letters, calls, or any forensic breakthroughs, the investigation had grown cold. For Dennis Rader, however, life was moving steadily forward, at least on the surface. At home in Park City, Rader was raising his 2 children alongside his wife Paula. He remained an active and respected member of Christ Lutheran Church, where he often volunteered and even served as the congregation president. At work, he continued his job with ADT Security Services, installing alarm systems for worried homeowners, a bitter irony considering his double life. He was also steadily climbing within Park City's small government, eventually working as a compliance officer, enforcing neighborhood codes and local ordinances. Neighbors would later recall how he carried himself with an intimidating sense of authority, issuing citations for overgrown grass, improperly parked cars, or trash bins left out too long. It gave him a sense of control and power that mirrored the compulsions driving his darker impulses. Behind closed doors, though, Rader's obsessions never went away. His journals and mother-lode collection grew more elaborate as he meticulously documented his fantasies. He saved newspaper clippings about the BTK murders, drew sketches of tied and bound women, and wrote out scenarios he imagined carrying out. Sometimes, he stalked potential victims, tracking their routines and studying their homes just as he had done in the 1970s and 1980s. While his outward life looked stable, internally his compulsions simmered. But Rader was growing older, and his family life and responsibilities became obstacles that forced him to scale back his activities. His wife Paula and his 2 children kept him busy, as did his job and church commitments. In these years, his killings paused, not because the urges were gone but because he had learned to suppress them temporarily. Still, he never abandoned his identity as BTK. That persona remained alive within him, and he nurtured it in secret, like a fire he knew he would one day stoke again. The Wichita Police Department had not forgotten BTK. By the mid-1990s, advances in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, began giving detectives new tools to revisit old cases. Crime scene samples that had been preserved from the 1970s and 1980s were being re-examined in hopes of finding matches in growing national DNA databases. However, BTK had not left enough viable material behind for an immediate breakthrough. While investigators were certain that technology would eventually solve the case, they needed the killer to resurface, make a mistake, or leave behind fresh evidence. For the time being, Dennis Rader's silence protected him. But silence didn't satisfy him forever. By the early 2000s, Rader had entered his mid-50s. His children were grown, and his structured suburban life began to feel hollow. He still held his position as a compliance officer, but the sense of control he once got from his job was no longer enough to feed the part of him that needed recognition. For years, he had watched other serial killers gain national attention. Figures like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and John Wayne Gacy had all become infamous. BTK, by contrast, was fading into obscurity. He despised the idea of being forgotten. In January 2004, Rader made a decision that would change everything. On the 30th anniversary of the Otero family murders, his first known killings, the Wichita Eagle published a story revisiting the case. The article questioned whether BTK was dead or simply dormant, and asked if the city would ever know the truth. Rader read the piece and felt insulted by the suggestion that his legacy might be reduced to a mystery. He wanted the world to know he was still alive. More importantly, he wanted credit for the killings investigators hadn't even linked to BTK yet. After 2 decades of silence, he decided to reawaken his persona. In March 2004, a package appeared at the Wichita Eagle newsroom. Inside was a collection of documents, including photocopies of crime scene photos, an ID card stolen from one of his victims, and a chilling letter in which the writer claimed responsibility for several murders. The package was signed with 3 infamous initials: BTK. Investigators immediately confirmed its authenticity based on details never released to the public. The quiet nightmare Wichita had buried came roaring back to life. The return of BTK sent shockwaves through the city. For younger residents, it was the first time they had even heard the name. For older ones, it reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Police quickly formed a new task force dedicated solely to BTK, this time armed with advanced technology, behavioral profiling, and a renewed sense of urgency. But Rader didn't stop with one package. Over the next several months, he sent multiple communications to the media and police, including letters, puzzles, and packages hidden in strange locations like libraries and rural roadsides. These weren't random taunts. They were carefully orchestrated attempts to reassert control over the narrative and remind Wichita of his power. By mid-2004, Rader escalated his game. In one communication, he left a cereal box with a doll inside tied up to mimic one of his victims. Inside the box, he placed more documents and drawings. This level of theatricality was new even for BTK and reflected his growing obsession with legacy. He wasn't just trying to terrify, he wanted to be remembered, studied, and feared. Investigators began to realize that his compulsion to communicate could be his undoing. Every letter, package, and drop site offered potential clues. Behind his mask of normalcy, Rader believed he was still untouchable. He continued his day-to-day life as though nothing had changed, attending church, mowing his lawn, and chatting with neighbors. People who knew him had no idea that the polite, somewhat meticulous man on their block was actively baiting the police in a cat-and-mouse game. Yet his need for attention was blinding him to his vulnerability. Forensic science had evolved drastically since the 1970s, and every new package increased the odds that investigators could trace him. This new phase of BTK communications gave authorities exactly what they had been waiting for: leverage. By allowing Rader to speak, Wichita detectives, the FBI, and other specialists could analyze his language, handwriting, drop patterns, and even physical traces from the packaging. He believed he was controlling the situation, but in reality, his ego was leading him directly toward his downfall. By the end of 2004, Wichita had been thrown back into a state of unease, but this time the hunt for BTK was far more sophisticated. For Rader, the return had reignited the sense of power he'd craved for decades. He felt relevant again. He believed he was smarter than investigators, outmaneuvering them at every step. What he didn't realize was that his reemergence was laying the groundwork for the mistakes that would expose him once and for all. The stage was now set for the final act of Dennis Rader's long, double life. His compulsions, ego, and hunger for recognition had brought him out of the shadows, but the world he was playing in was no longer the same one he had terrorized in the 1970s. Forensic science had advanced, investigative methods had evolved, and the city of Wichita was no longer complacent. The same man who had stayed invisible for decades was about to set into motion a series of decisions that would lead directly to his capture, and ultimately, the unmasking of BTK. By early 2005, Dennis Rader had fully reawakened the BTK persona that had remained dormant for nearly 2 decades. In his mind, he had regained control of his story, forcing Wichita to remember him and sparking a renewed wave of fear and intrigue. But what Rader didn't realize was that times had changed. Advancements in forensic technology, digital tracking, and behavioral profiling meant that the same cat-and-mouse game he had played with investigators in the 1970s would not end the same way this time. His ego and obsession with recognition would ultimately lead him directly into the trap that police had been waiting decades to set. After re-establishing contact with authorities in 2004, Rader escalated his taunts. He left cryptic letters and packages in various locations around Wichita, including cereal boxes containing dolls bound and posed to resemble his victims. Inside, he included photocopies of stolen items, diagrams, and long rambling notes, where he referred to himself in the third person as BTK and relived the details of his murders. Investigators carefully collected each drop, preserving every fragment of tape, fingerprint, fiber, and DNA residue they could find. Forensic science had advanced enough by this point that even the smallest mistake could leave a trail, something Rader had not fully considered. Despite his careful planning, his need for control kept driving him to take risks. In one message sent in late 2004, Rader asked investigators a question that would become his undoing. He wanted to know if police could trace information from a floppy disk. If they promised it was safe, he said, he would send them one containing details about BTK's crimes. It was a moment of arrogance, a belief that he could outsmart authorities with nothing more than trust and manipulation. In response, detectives crafted a strategic plan. Through a Wichita television station, KTV, they answered his question publicly, falsely assuring him that a floppy disk would be untraceable. On February 16, 2005, a small purple Memorex floppy disk arrived at KSAS-TV, a Fox affiliate in Wichita, as part of one of Rader's communications. Investigators now had exactly what they needed. Within hours, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation and the FBI's cybercrime specialists began analyzing the metadata hidden within the disk's files. What they discovered stunned them. The disk contained an embedded Microsoft Word document, and the metadata identified the last user as Dennis and linked the document to Christ Lutheran Church. A quick online search connected the name to Dennis Rader, the church's president, who also happened to live in Park City. This was the first time investigators had a tangible, verifiable lead in decades. But a name wasn't enough to make an arrest, not in a case this high profile. Detectives needed physical evidence tying Rader to BTK's crimes. That's when they turned to his family. Quietly, without tipping off Rader or his neighbors, authorities obtained a warrant to collect DNA from his daughter, Carrie Rawson, by retrieving a sample from a medical procedure she had undergone. When forensic scientists compared her DNA to evidence preserved from the crime scenes, the match was undeniable. The familial connection between Rader and BTK was scientifically established. As the evidence mounted, authorities began carefully planning Rader's arrest. Despite the explosive nature of the case, they wanted to avoid chaos, confrontation, or giving him any opportunity to harm himself or others. For weeks, surveillance teams monitored his daily routines, logging when he left for work, where he drove, and the patterns of his movements. Investigators were also concerned that Rader might still have weapons or incriminating material in his home, so the plan needed to be executed with precision. On February 25, 2005, after nearly 31 years of investigation, the hunt for BTK came to an end. That morning, Rader left his office at Park City's municipal building in his black Jeep Cherokee. As he drove, an unmarked convoy of law enforcement vehicles moved into position. When he reached the intersection of 37th and Greenwich Road, officers surrounded his car and ordered him to step out. Without resistance, Dennis Rader was handcuffed and placed under arrest. One of the lead detectives leaned in and said, "Hello, Mr. Rader." Rader calmly replied, "I guess I know why you're here." Within hours, news of the arrest spread across Wichita and the nation. The man who had spent decades hiding in plain sight, the church president, Boy Scout leader, family man, and seemingly unremarkable neighbor, had been unmasked as one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. While residents expressed shock, many investigators who had worked the case for years felt a mix of relief and disbelief. After decades of painstaking effort, the identity of BTK was no longer a mystery. At the police station, Rader initially denied involvement, attempting to feign ignorance, but when confronted with the DNA evidence, the floppy disk metadata, and decades of carefully preserved records, he realized there was no escape. Within hours, he agreed to talk, and what followed stunned even the most seasoned detectives. Over the course of 30 hours of recorded interviews, Rader confessed in meticulous, emotionless detail to the 10 murders attributed to BTK between 1974 and 1991. He recounted how he had stalked his victims, planned his attacks, and carried them out with chilling precision. Detectives described his demeanor as polite and cooperative, but disturbingly detached. He spoke of his crimes as though recounting mundane errands, referring to them as projects rather than murders. During these confessions, Rader revealed a disturbing glimpse into his psychology. He explained how he had compartmentalized his life into two distinct identities: Dennis Rader, the husband, father, and community servant, and BTK, the killer driven by what he called Factor X, a dark compulsion he claimed had controlled him since childhood. According to Rader, he felt compelled to bind, torture, kill, a phrase he had proudly coined decades earlier, and his murders were meticulously planned fantasies brought to life. Investigators were both horrified and fascinated by his calm, methodical storytelling. He showed no genuine remorse for his victims, instead expressing frustration over technical aspects of his crimes, as though perfection mattered more than human life. After his confession, authorities conducted extensive searches of his home, vehicles, and storage facilities. Inside his house, they discovered a treasure trove of incriminating evidence: handwritten journals detailing his murders, sketches of bound women, photographs, and newspaper clippings of his crimes. In one small hideaway, investigators found what they called the mother lode, Rader's personal collection of memorabilia, including driver's licenses, jewelry, and items stolen from his victims. These discoveries not only confirmed his confessions but also provided chilling insight into his obsessive need to relive his crimes over and over again. In the weeks following his arrest, the Wichita community struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster behind the BTK murders. Neighbors described Rader as quiet, meticulous, and sometimes stern but never threatening. Church members were stunned that the man who had served as president of their congregation had been living a double life. Even his family was blindsided. His daughter Carrie would later write about the devastation of learning her father's secret, describing it as an irreparable shattering of trust and identity. Meanwhile, prosecutors worked swiftly to build their case. With Rader's confession, DNA evidence, and physical artifacts from his home, there was no doubt about his guilt. But the legal process required precision. Each charge, one for each of the 10 victims, had to be formally presented, and Rader had to be evaluated to ensure he was mentally competent to stand trial. Despite his claims of being driven by Factor X, psychological assessments determined that he was fully aware of his actions and capable of understanding right from wrong. By June 2005, Dennis Rader stood before the court and pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. During the hearing, he delivered an unnerving, matter-of-fact recounting of each killing, describing the steps he took before, during, and after each crime. Families of the victims sat in the courtroom, many in tears, as he spoke without hesitation, remorse, or compassion. For investigators and survivors alike, hearing the details directly from BTK's mouth was both validating and agonizing. After decades of uncertainty, the truth was finally laid bare, but closure was elusive. At his sentencing hearing in August 2005, Rader faced the families of his victims. In Kansas at the time, the death penalty was not an option because his crimes had been committed before its reinstatement. Instead, he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Before the sentence was read, family members of his victims spoke directly to him, expressing their anger, heartbreak, and lifelong grief. After his sentencing in August 2005, Dennis Rader was transferred to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas to begin serving 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. For the man who had once thrived on control, secrecy, and the thrill of outsmarting investigators, prison life was a brutal reversal of power. Gone was the suburban home where he carefully curated his image as a church leader and family man. Gone were the secret caches of drawings, trophies, and plans he'd once used to feed his fantasies. Now, Rader's world was reduced to a small, stark cell and a rigid daily routine dictated by others, a reality that stripped him of the dominance he had spent decades chasing. Upon his arrival, prison officials took extraordinary precautions. Although his crimes had made him infamous, they also put him at risk among the general inmate population. There were concerns that someone might attempt to harm him for notoriety or revenge. As a result, Rader was placed under special management status, meaning his movements were heavily restricted and closely monitored. He spent up to 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, allowed out briefly for exercise in a secure, enclosed area. These strict measures weren't just for his protection. Authorities also worried about his psychological state, unsure whether prolonged isolation would trigger erratic or violent behavior. During his initial months in prison, Rader underwent a series of psychological evaluations. Experts from the Kansas Department of Corrections, the FBI, and independent forensic psychologists studied his behavior and mental state to better understand his motivations. What they found was both fascinating and disturbing. Rader did not fit neatly into one diagnostic box. He showed traits consistent with narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, marked by a lack of empathy, an inflated sense of self-importance, and an obsession with control. But he also demonstrated obsessive-compulsive tendencies, particularly in the meticulous planning of his murders and the way he cataloged his projects. One recurring theme in these evaluations was his belief in what he called Factor X, a term he used to describe the dark compulsion he claimed had driven him since childhood. Rader insisted that this inner force, a combination of violent fantasies, sexual gratification, and an overpowering desire for dominance, was beyond his control. Psychologists disagreed, noting that while compulsions may have influenced him, his actions showed deliberate choice, planning, and awareness of consequences. In their view, Rader wasn't compelled to kill by forces outside himself. He chose to, and he enjoyed it. Despite his confinement, Rader found ways to maintain a sense of relevance. He began corresponding with journalists, criminologists, and occasionally curious members of the public. These letters were closely monitored by prison staff, but they revealed glimpses of his shifting mindset. In some, Rader portrayed himself as remorseful, expressing sorrow for the pain he had caused the victims' families. In others, he slipped back into the persona of BTK, offering detailed accounts of his murders, sketches of crime scenes, and explanations of his projects that bordered on self-aggrandizing. For investigators who studied his communications, it became clear that while Rader could mimic remorse when he wanted, he still derived satisfaction from recounting his crimes, evidence that his fantasies remained alive, even if his actions were confined. Outside the prison walls, Wichita and the broader public were grappling with the aftermath of his capture. For over 30 years, the BTK case had cast a shadow of fear across the city, and while his arrest in 2005 brought relief, it also unearthed painful memories. Families of the victims continued to speak out, pushing for healing while also confronting the reality that Rader still existed, still breathed, and still sometimes seemed to seek attention. Several of them expressed frustration when his letters or drawings surfaced, believing he was using correspondence as a way to prolong his presence in the public consciousness. For Rader's family, the fallout was even more devastating. His wife, Paula, divorced him immediately after his arrest, legally severing ties with the man she had been married to for over 3 decades. His daughter, Carrie Rawson, spent years processing the revelation that the father she loved, the man who had taught her to ride a bike, led her Girl Scout troop, and sat beside her in church, had been living a double life as BTK. Carrie eventually came forward publicly, giving interviews and writing a memoir, A Serial Killer's Daughter, where she shared her journey of reckoning with her father's crimes. She described moments of disbelief, guilt, and anger, recounting how she struggled to reconcile the kind, protective father she knew with the cold, calculating killer she learned about in court. In her memoir, Carrie also revealed that Rader attempted to reach out to her after his arrest, sending letters from prison that mixed affection with chilling detachment. While some family members cut ties entirely, Carrie eventually chose to communicate with him cautiously, balancing her need for answers with the emotional toll of maintaining contact. Their exchanges offered rare insight into Rader's state of mind behind bars. In some messages, he expressed regret for betraying his family. In others, he drifted into cryptic language about his projects and Factor X, as though still reliving his crimes in his imagination. For prison officials, managing Rader's communications became a delicate task. While his letters were legal, there were strict limitations on what he could send or receive, especially if the content risked re-traumatizing victims' families or sensationalizing his crimes. In several instances, journalists and true crime writers requested interviews, but most were denied due to concerns that Rader sought fame rather than rehabilitation. Investigators working cold cases, however, were granted access to him under controlled conditions. Criminologists and behavioral analysts studied Rader in depth, using his case to understand how long-term serial offenders operate, how they hide in plain sight, and what drives their compulsions. One of the most significant revelations from these sessions was how meticulously Rader separated his identities. He described his BTK persona almost as though it were another person entirely, referring to his murders as special assignments, and explaining how he would enter a different mental state when stalking and killing his victims. Yet investigators noted that while he liked to portray this split, he also blurred the lines when it suited him, suggesting that the duality was more about control than actual dissociation. He wanted to be seen as both an ordinary man and a brilliant predator, crafting his own mythology around BTK. life inside El Dorado eventually settled into a predictable rhythm. Rader's days began early, with headcounts, brief exercise periods, and scheduled meals. Most of his time was spent reading, writing, and corresponding under supervision. He occasionally met with prison psychologists and chaplains, though his sessions focused more on assessing his behavior than offering treatment. Given his diagnosis, authorities did not believe rehabilitation was realistic. While other inmates sometimes tried to provoke him, his isolated housing and constant monitoring prevented significant confrontations. For someone who once thrived on stalking and manipulating others, the monotony of prison life was its own form of punishment. Even so, Rader occasionally attempted to insert himself into the public eye. In 2016, reports surfaced that he had cooperated with the FBI's VCAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, initiative, providing insight into his methods for analyzing patterns in unsolved murders. While some investigators found his input useful, others viewed it skeptically, questioning whether Rader exaggerated his cleverness to maintain relevance. His name reappeared in headlines again in 2019 when Carey published her memoir, reigniting interest in the BTK case and sparking debates over whether the media was inadvertently giving him the attention he craved. Despite the occasional public flare-ups, Rader's world has remained confined to the same small cell where he has spent nearly 2 decades. His health has declined somewhat over the years, but he continues to correspond with researchers and investigators, often returning to his Factor X narrative and the themes of control and dominance that defined his life before prison. While he is no longer a threat to the outside world, his interviews remain deeply unsettling for those who study criminal psychology, providing a rare look into the long-term mindset of a serial offender who operated undetected for decades. For Wichita, the passage of time has dulled some of the fear, but the wounds remain. Memorials to the victims, community support groups, and outreach efforts for survivors of violent crime have helped bring healing, but the shadow of BTK lingers. The name Dennis Rader has become synonymous with betrayal, not just of his family and community, but of the trust that allowed him to hide in plain sight for so long. By the time Dennis Rader had spent over a decade behind bars at the El Dorado Correctional Facility, the quiet routines of prison life had firmly replaced the secret double existence he once thrived on. His days were stripped of the control and manipulation that fueled his fantasies as BTK, yet Rader still sought ways to maintain a sense of significance. From his small, isolated cell, he followed news articles about crime, law enforcement, and cold cases, often commenting on them in letters to investigators and researchers. While Rader could no longer act on his compulsions, he had not fully let go of his obsession with his identity as BTK. By the mid-2010s, Rader became a subject of renewed attention, not only from criminologists but also from law enforcement working on unsolved homicides across the country. Investigators began to revisit cold cases from the 1970s and 1980s, wondering if Rader's trail of victims could be longer than originally believed. Though convicted of 10 murders, Rader had hinted in both interviews and letters that there were other projects he'd started but never finished, sparking speculation that his crimes might extend beyond what Wichita authorities had confirmed. These insinuations became particularly intriguing in 2016 when the FBI and Kansas Bureau of Investigation reached out to him for participation in their VCAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, initiative. During these sessions, Rader provided detailed explanations about how he selected victims, stalked them, and developed what he called kits. He recounted how he carefully observed potential targets for weeks or months, learning their routines until he identified a vulnerability. Investigators found his descriptions deeply unsettling because of the cold precision with which he spoke, as if revisiting carefully archived memories rather than confronting horrific acts. While some analysts hoped these discussions might help close unsolved cases, others doubted Rader's reliability. He had a documented history of exaggerating his cleverness and relishing the attention tied to his crimes. Still, investigators continued engaging him, hoping to extract useful insights that could apply broadly to profiling other offenders. Meanwhile, outside the prison, his daughter Carrie Rawson was gradually becoming an unexpected voice in the broader conversation around trauma, forgiveness, and survival. Her memoir, A Serial Killer's Daughter, published in 2019, brought renewed focus to the deep personal toll his crimes had inflicted on his family. Carrie's willingness to share her story created space for dialogue around the lingering effects of violent crime on relatives of both victims and perpetrators. In interviews, she explained how she had come to terms with the duality of her father, the man who helped her with homework and attended church on Sundays, and the man who meticulously planned and carried out brutal murders without remorse. Carrie also revealed that her father continued writing her letters from prison, sometimes lengthy and filled with cryptic references to his projects and Factor X. She described reading these letters with a mix of dread and curiosity, occasionally finding herself emotionally drained by his attempts to weave his BTK persona into their conversations. While she sometimes responded, her contact remained measured, guided by her need for boundaries and emotional safety. Through her memoir and advocacy work, she became an influential figure for others navigating the aftermath of discovering hidden truths about loved ones. Around this same time, law enforcement attention on Rader intensified again due to potential connections between BTK and other unsolved murders in Kansas, Oklahoma, and even Texas. In one notable instance, detectives revisited the 1990 disappearance of Cynthia Dawn Kinney, a 16-year-old from Pawhuska, Oklahoma. While Rader has never been charged or formally linked to the case, his known patterns, including his routes as a security compliance officer and his access to small communities, made investigators consider him a possible person of interest. As late as 2023, Oklahoma authorities publicly confirmed they were still evaluating whether Rader might have been involved. For his part, Rader oscillated between cooperation and manipulation when asked about such cases. Sometimes he denied involvement outright, other times, he teased investigators with vague remarks about unfinished projects, hinting at secrets he might take to the grave. Whether these claims were legitimate or an attempt to maintain control over his narrative remains uncertain, but the ambiguity kept cold case units engaged. To ensure accuracy, authorities cross-referenced his personal records, movements, and employment history from the 1970s onward. Despite extensive work, no verified connections beyond his 10 confirmed murders have been conclusively established, though several investigations remain open. Inside El Dorado, Rader's life had become increasingly solitary. With advancing age and declining health, his world narrowed to his books, writing materials, and monitored correspondence. Reports from correctional staff indicated that he maintained an orderly cell, reflecting the obsessive organization that had characterized his life before incarceration. He frequently filled notebooks with writings about his past, theological reflections, and his own interpretation of criminal psychology. On occasion, he also produced drawings, crude sketches depicting his projects, often labeled with dates, initials, or symbolic references. These images, discovered in seized letters, unsettled investigators because they showed that his violent fantasies, while contained, had not disappeared. In 2018, criminologists from several universities collaborated with Kansas authorities to conduct in-depth interviews with Rader for research into long-term serial offenders. These sessions revealed more about his psychological landscape than earlier evaluations. Analysts observed that Rader's descriptions of his killings lacked emotional resonance. He recounted events with the same tone one might use to describe household chores. He spoke in detail about how he compartmentalized his identities, referring to Dennis Rader, the husband, father, and church leader, and BTK, the operator, who executed projects for gratification. What disturbed researchers most was the apparent absence of guilt or empathy, even after years of isolation. Still, there were moments where his humanity slipped through, especially when discussing his family. He occasionally expressed regret over the pain he caused Paula, Carrie, and his son, though experts debated whether this regret reflected genuine remorse or frustration at losing his carefully crafted facade as a devoted father. This distinction mattered because, for decades, Rader's ability to blend into society had shielded him from suspicion. His seeming normalcy, an active church member, Boy Scout leader, and municipal inspector, allowed him to operate undetected for over 30 years. As his case continued drawing attention, Rader occasionally found himself the subject of documentaries, podcasts, and streaming series examining high-profile crimes. While the Kansas Department of Corrections prohibited him from receiving financial benefit from these portrayals, media producers often tried to obtain his letters or recordings for background material. Victims' families expressed frustration that his name remained so prominent in the public sphere, fearing that renewed interest risked sensationalizing his crimes rather than focusing on the lives lost. Wichita officials and local advocacy groups responded by organizing memorial events to honor the victims, shifting the narrative away from Rader's notoriety. Even after nearly 2 decades behind bars, the BTK case remains a subject of active study for behavioral analysts. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit continues to use Rader's history to refine models for identifying serial offenders who blend seamlessly into their communities. One major insight drawn from the case is how Rader weaponized his social normalcy, his position as a trusted neighbor, church leader, and compliance officer, to gain access and avoid suspicion. Investigators now emphasize these behavioral patterns when profiling offenders who evade detection for long periods. Meanwhile, Rader's interactions with researchers highlight the enduring paradox of his personality, the coexistence of meticulous control and compulsive need. On the one hand, he planned his murders with precision, maintaining detailed records and stalking victims methodically. On the other, he made reckless decisions later in life, most famously mailing a floppy disk to police, believing it couldn't be traced, a mistake that ultimately led to his arrest. This contradiction continues to fascinate psychologists, illustrating how even highly controlled offenders can experience lapses in judgment when ego, curiosity, or a desire for attention takes over. Today, Rader spends nearly all of his time in near-total isolation, with limited contact outside researchers, select family members, and correctional staff. His health has reportedly deteriorated in recent years, and while he occasionally writes to investigators, his letters have grown shorter and less frequent. Despite the decades that have passed, the debate over his full scope of crimes remains unresolved. While authorities maintain that his 10 confirmed murders are the only verified acts tied as the years passed inside El Dorado Correctional Facility, Dennis Rader's world grew increasingly confined, both physically and psychologically. Once a man who thrived on control, secrecy, and manipulation, his reality had been reduced to a small concrete cell, rigid routines, and brief interactions with correctional staff. Yet outside those prison walls, his name continued to surface in unexpected ways. Nearly 2 decades after his arrest, the BTK case remains alive, not because of Rader's actions now, but because of the lingering mysteries surrounding his past and the renewed efforts of investigators to determine whether all of his crimes have truly been accounted for. By 2022, law enforcement across multiple states had begun taking a closer look at Rader again. Advances in forensic technology and a wave of cold case reopenings prompted fresh examinations into his possible connections to other unsolved murders and disappearances dating back to the 1970s and 1980s. Among the most significant developments came from Osage County, Oklahoma, where Sheriff Eddie Verdon announced a renewed investigation into the 1976 disappearance of Cynthia Dawn Kinney, a 16-year-old cheerleader who vanished after doing laundry at a local dry cleaner in Pawhuska. The case had haunted the community for decades, but a combination of new information and Rader's known movements during that period made him a potential person of interest. What sparked this renewed focus was the discovery of old employment records showing that Rader, while working as a compliance officer and installing security systems, frequently traveled through northeastern Oklahoma, including areas close to Pawhuska. Investigators also examined his writings, sketches, and personal notes, some of which referenced locations and symbols that bore a disturbing resemblance to details in Kinney's case. Sheriff Verdon revealed in interviews that he and his team had visited Rader in prison to ask direct questions about his movements in the mid-1970s. Rader neither confirmed nor denied involvement, giving cryptic responses that, in his characteristic way, left room for interpretation. These ambiguous answers frustrated investigators but also fueled further inquiry. Oklahoma authorities began working with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, and the FBI to map out Rader's activities during that period. His employment as an ADT installer gave him access to hundreds of homes and businesses across Kansas and Oklahoma, and his inspection routes for Park City's compliance office placed him in numerous small communities where disappearances occurred. In addition to the Kinney case, other cold cases in Oklahoma and Missouri were reviewed for potential connections, though no definitive links have yet been established. The Kinney investigation brought national attention back to Rader, and with it came renewed focus on his psychology. Analysts revisited his interviews and letters to determine whether his cryptic statements about unfinished projects hinted at more victims or were simply manipulative tactics designed to keep himself relevant. Over the years, Rader has shown a pattern of maintaining control through mystery. His early communications with Wichita police, filled with puzzles and codes, were designed to provoke curiosity and fear. In prison, he has used a similar strategy, offering just enough information to keep investigators and researchers engaged without providing the closure families desperately seek. One of the most significant challenges for authorities has been separating fact from performance. Rader has spent years cultivating an identity as BTK, the meticulous planner and master manipulator. In some of his prison interviews, he has openly admitted to enjoying the power he once held over police and the media, describing how carefully he crafted his letters and staged crime scenes to maximize terror. But now, nearly 2 decades removed from his last confirmed killing, some wonder if Rader clings to his legacy as a way of retaining relevance in a world where time has stripped away his freedom and influence. For the families of unsolved victims, however, the stakes are far more than symbolic. In Oklahoma, Kinney's relatives have been following the investigation closely, hoping for answers after almost half a century of uncertainty. Sheriff Verdon has stressed that the renewed focus on Rader doesn't mean he's guilty of more crimes. Instead, investigators are working to be thorough, ensuring no possibility is overlooked. Advances in forensic technology, including improved DNA recovery methods, have allowed investigators to revisit old evidence from several cases. Samples that were once considered too degraded for analysis are now being tested again, raising hopes that new information might emerge. Meanwhile, Rader's personal circumstances in prison have changed as age and health issues take their toll. Now in his late 70s, his once rigidly structured persona has begun to deteriorate. Reports from El Dorado suggest that Rader has suffered from multiple physical ailments, including heart problems and limited mobility. He is no longer the controlled, active figure he once was and spends much of his day writing letters, sketching, and reading crime-related material. Despite his declining health, he continues to correspond with investigators, researchers, and occasionally his daughter, though those exchanges have grown more infrequent over the years. His daughter, Carrie Rawson, remains one of the most public voices navigating the complicated emotional aftermath of her father's crimes. Though she has distanced herself from him, she has also chosen to participate in advocacy work for victims' families and has cooperated with law enforcement investigating possible links between Rader and unsolved cases. In recent interviews, Carrie has spoken about the renewed Oklahoma investigation, expressing both hope for answers and frustration with her father's continued manipulation. She described how he often frames his cryptic comments in ways designed to maintain power over others, playing on investigators' and family members' need for closure. In 2023, the Kinney investigation intensified after investigators discovered Rader's handwritten sketches, recovered from materials seized during his arrest years earlier. One of these sketches reportedly depicted a barn near where Kinney was last seen. While this does not prove his involvement, it raised troubling questions about whether he was familiar with the area or had scouted it during his travels. Investigators began searching locations in Oklahoma based on these clues, though as of the latest reports, no physical evidence has tied Rader directly to the case. Beyond Oklahoma, authorities in Kansas and Missouri have also revisited several unsolved murders and disappearances, cross-referencing timelines, geography, and behavioral patterns with Rader's known movements. Investigators stress that serial offenders often have longer victim lists than officially documented, and BTK's level of organization suggests the possibility of additional crimes remains open. However, Proving these connections decades later is extraordinarily difficult without physical evidence or direct confessions, both of which remain elusive. For criminal profilers, Rader's case continues to serve as a foundational study in understanding offenders who successfully hide in plain sight. His ability to maintain a stable family life, hold steady employment, and gain trust within his community while secretly committing brutal crimes challenges traditional investigative assumptions. The renewed interest in BTK has prompted the FBI and behavioral scientists to refine their models for identifying serial offenders who exploit positions of trust or access. Rader's time as a compliance officer and ADT installer provided him with opportunities few questioned at the time, a factor experts now consider critical when examining similar unsolved cases. Despite all of this, Rader remains both a resource and an obstacle. On one hand, he has provided useful details in his conversations with law enforcement, helping investigators better understand his methods and psychology. On the other, his tendency to withhold key information, or drip-feed partial truths designed to keep others engaged, has limited the usefulness of his cooperation. Investigators working cold cases describe these interactions as a constant balancing act between leveraging his insights and resisting his attempts at manipulation. For Wichita and the broader Kansas community, these renewed investigations have reopened old wounds. The shadow of BTK still lingers nearly 20 years after his arrest, not just because of the brutality of his crimes but because of the fear and mistrust he left behind. For decades, residents lived under the threat of an unknown killer who blended seamlessly into daily life. Today, while the city has healed in many ways, the possibility that Rader's crimes extend beyond the 10 confirmed murders has stirred anxiety and reopened conversations about safety, trust, and how communities process collective trauma. Even within prison walls, Rader's life reflects this tension between fading relevance and enduring notoriety. He continues to receive letters from true crime enthusiasts and researchers, though his responses have become shorter, often rambling, and increasingly incoherent compared to his earlier writings. Observers note that his once meticulous memory has shown signs of decline, suggesting potential cognitive deterioration. Still, his name carries weight, both in investigative circles and in broader discussions about serial crime media. Years after his arrest, Dennis Rader remained an enigmatic figure, a study in the contradictions of human behavior. On the surface, he appeared to be an ordinary man, married, church-going, and active in his community. Yet behind that facade lay one of the most methodical and manipulative serial killers in American history. Even decades after his crimes, psychologists, criminologists, and law enforcement professionals continued to examine Rader's life and behavior, attempting to understand the mind behind BTK. Rader's manipulative tendencies were evident long before his capture. He had an uncanny ability to maintain control over both his victims and his environment, which was reinforced by his outwardly normal persona. He thrived on secrecy and deceit, often relishing the contrast between the mundane image he presented to the world and the violent acts he committed in private. His capacity for compartmentalization, separating his family life from his criminal activities, remains one of the most striking aspects of his psychological profile. Experts have noted that this skill enabled him to operate undetected for decades, earning him a unique place in the study of organized offenders. One element that fascinated psychologists was Rader's need for recognition. Despite carefully planning his crimes to avoid detection, he sent taunting letters to the Wichita police and local newspapers, signing them with the moniker BTK. Bind, torture, kill. These communications were designed to assert dominance over both law enforcement and the public. They demonstrated a profound understanding of human psychology, as he calculated not only the fear they would inspire but also the attention and notoriety they would bring him. Modern criminal profiling often points to this need for attention as a hallmark of organized serial offenders, particularly those who display narcissistic traits. In the years following his conviction, researchers gained rare access to Rader's reflections on his own behavior, primarily through recorded interviews and written correspondence. These materials revealed a man who was highly introspective yet consistently manipulative. He oscillated between self-justification, rationalization, and calculated confession. At times, he portrayed himself as a victim of his own compulsions, while at other times he took deliberate pride in the meticulous nature of his crimes. This duality, acknowledging guilt while preserving control over his narrative, has made his case an enduring study in psychopathy, narcissism, and compulsive behavior. One of the more recent insights from psychological research on Rader involves his ability to plan and execute complex crimes while maintaining his social roles. For example, he served as a Cub Scout leader, a church president, and a compliance officer for ADT Security Services, all while carrying out the BTK murders. These roles provided him with both access and camouflage. Behavioral analysts note that this ability to exploit trust and authority figures as cover is a defining characteristic of many organized serial offenders, yet Rader's case stands out due to the length of time he sustained it without detection. The challenge for investigators then and now has been understanding how ordinary traits, reliability, community involvement, even charm, can coexist with extreme antisocial behavior. Rader's manipulations extended into prison life as well. Once incarcerated, he continued to write letters and respond selectively to inquiries from journalists and researchers. Some letters were cooperative, offering details about his crimes. Others were designed to confuse or maintain intrigue. Experts studying these correspondences have argued that Rader's communications reveal not only his continued desire for control but also the enduring compulsions that characterized his criminal behavior. Even confined, he sought influence over how he was perceived, carefully curating the narrative that surrounded him. In 2023, renewed attention to his possible connections with cold cases further emphasized the ongoing relevance of his psychological profile. Investigators in Kansas and Oklahoma revisited his activities in the 1970s and 1980s, considering whether his methods could apply to unsolved murders outside Wichita. Analysts studied patterns in his known crimes, selection of victims, timing, methodical planning, and communications with authorities, to assess whether similarities existed elsewhere. This approach highlights the broader importance of understanding organized serial offenders. Each case informs the methodology used to investigate subsequent unsolved crimes. Another area of focus has been Rader's adaptability. During the BTK investigation, law enforcement observed that he evolved his methods to avoid detection, adjusting his routines, communications, and crime scenes in response to media coverage and police strategies. This adaptability, combined with his ability to feign normalcy, demonstrates a level of cognitive sophistication often underestimated in discussions about serial offenders. Modern profiling techniques place significant emphasis on this adaptability, as it allows behavioral analysts to differentiate between impulsive, disorganized offenders and highly organized, methodical predators like Rader. Forensic psychologists have also noted the interplay between Rader's personality disorders and his criminal behavior. Reports from his pretrial and post-conviction evaluations suggested traits consistent with narcissistic personality disorder and possible obsessive-compulsive tendencies. These traits manifest in a compulsion for control, meticulous planning, and ritualized behavior, all of which characterized his approach to the BTK murders. Understanding this interplay has been instrumental in educating law enforcement and mental health professionals about the warning signs of similar offenders, particularly those who operate unnoticed within their communities. The case of Dennis Rader also underscores the long-term impact on families of victims. Interviews with surviving relatives reveal that the uncertainty surrounding his communications and the slow unfolding of evidence prolonged trauma for decades. Even after his capture, letters and confessions kept some families in a state of psychological tension, as they weighed whether he was revealing complete truths or manipulating them further. This aspect of serial crime, the ongoing psychological manipulation of victims' families, remains a critical concern for modern investigators and mental health professionals providing post-trauma support. Despite the passage of time, Rader's presence in popular culture and true crime research continues to grow. Documentaries, podcasts, and scholarly articles revisit his case, exploring both the horror of his crimes and the lessons to be learned about detection, psychological profiling, and the importance of community vigilance. Behavioral scientists often cite BTK as a paradigm example of how organized offenders can evade detection by blending into everyday life. His case reinforces the need for meticulous investigation, long-term observation, and cross-jurisdictional cooperation in identifying patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed. Even as Rader ages in prison, his psychological footprint lingers. Modern studies on aging offenders examine how cognitive decline, health issues, and social isolation affect incarcerated serial killers. While Rader's physical and mental capabilities have undoubtedly diminished, researchers continue to assess whether he retains the same manipulative tendencies and cognitive planning abilities that defined his earlier behavior. These studies contribute not only to forensic psychology but also to broader questions about criminal justice, risk assessment, and the management of long-term offenders. Ultimately, Dennis Rader remains a living case study, one whose impact extends far beyond the crimes he committed. His ability to manipulate, plan, and maintain a facade of normalcy has provided law enforcement and behavioral analysts with critical insights into organized serial offending. Ongoing investigations, renewed interest in cold cases, and advances in psychological research ensure that BTK's story continues to inform modern understandings of human behavior, criminal psychology, and the systems required to prevent similar tragedies. Even in confinement, decades removed from his last confirmed murder, Rader exemplifies the complexities of evil, control, and the human capacity for deception. Decades after Dennis Rader's arrest, the shadow of BTK continues to loom over Wichita, the surrounding communities, and the broader field of criminal justice. While his life behind bars has been one of physical confinement, the psychological, cultural, and investigative repercussions of his actions remain expansive. Families of his confirmed victims continue to grapple with grief and trauma, while law enforcement and behavioral analysts study his case to understand the mechanisms that allowed him to operate undetected for so long. Rader's legacy is complex. To some, he is simply the man who terrorized a community, committing heinous acts that left 10 people dead and countless others fearful for their safety. To others, he is a case study in the intersection of psychopathy, narcissism, and organized crime. Behavioral scientists and criminal profilers often reference BTK as a textbook example of a methodical serial offender who maintained the appearance of normalcy while pursuing a compulsion for control and violence. The careful planning, meticulous record-keeping, and ability to compartmentalize his dual lives have made him an enduring subject in criminology courses, forensic psychology seminars, and law enforcement training. Yet the story of Dennis Rader is not just about methodology or psychology. It is also about the lasting human impact of his crimes. Families of the victims describe the enduring emotional toll of waiting for answers, enduring the lengthy investigation, and processing the media attention surrounding his arrest and trial. The confessions and letters he sent, both before and after his capture, often served to manipulate or prolong the suffering of those left behind. Some families have turned this trauma into advocacy, sharing their experiences to educate the public about victim support, crime prevention, and the importance of community vigilance. Others remain haunted, grappling with the knowledge that Rader's compulsion drove him to commit acts that irreversibly altered their lives. Law enforcement continues to be influenced by Rader's case. The strategies used to capture BTK, including forensic analysis, psychological profiling, and meticulous cross-referencing of employment and travel records, have informed modern techniques in serial crime investigations. The realization that Rader could maintain a respected social and professional presence while committing violent crimes has reshaped assumptions about offenders. Today, detectives and behavioral analysts routinely consider the possibility of hidden in plain sight perpetrators, ensuring that investigations do not overlook those who appear outwardly ordinary. In recent years, technological advances have furthered the study of Rader's crimes. DNA testing, digital archiving, and cold case re-examinations allow investigators to revisit evidence with a precision unavailable in the 1970s and 1980s. In some instances, these methods have been used to explore potential links between Rader and other unsolved cases, though no additional charges have been confirmed. Scholars and law enforcement experts emphasize that the legacy of BTK lies not only in the crimes he committed but also in the lessons learned regarding evidence preservation, interagency cooperation, and the application of behavioral analysis in long-term investigations. Psychologists and criminologists also examine Rader's case to better understand the interplay between personality disorders and criminal behavior. Traits such as narcissism, obsessive compulsiveness, and a need for control were evident in his planning and execution of murders. His communications with law enforcement and the media displayed manipulative tendencies, a calculated desire for attention, and a predilection for instilling fear. Studying these characteristics has helped refine modern offender profiles and informs the assessment of suspects who may engage in similar behaviors while maintaining seemingly ordinary lives. Media representations of Rader, from documentaries to podcasts, continue to influence public perception of serial crime. These portrayals emphasize not just his crimes but the environment that allowed him to thrive, communities that trusted him, investigative limitations of the time, and societal assumptions about family men and community leaders. While some media approaches have been criticized for sensationalizing BTK, others focus on the broader educational and cautionary aspects of his story, reinforcing the need for public awareness and critical thinking when examining criminal behavior. Rader's case also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating the duality of human behavior. He was a husband, father, and church president, roles that allowed him to blend into society and evade suspicion. This dual existence highlights the challenge in identifying threats when outward appearances conform to societal expectations. Law enforcement continues to use BTK as an example of how organized offenders exploit trust, relationships, and routine interactions to commit crimes over extended periods. His ability to navigate and manipulate social structures remains one of the defining lessons drawn from the case. For survivors of crime and advocacy groups, Rader's story reinforces the importance of victim-centered approaches. The prolonged uncertainty, fear, and psychological manipulation inflicted on families of BTK's victims illustrate the long-term effects of violent crime beyond the immediate physical harm. Organizations working with survivors use cases like Rader's to develop support programs, trauma-informed approaches, and public education initiatives aimed at preventing similar tragedies and mitigating their societal impact. Even as Rader ages in prison, his presence continues to provoke discussion about morality, justice, and rehabilitation. Some scholars question the nature of punishment in cases involving highly organized offenders with extreme psychological disturbances. Rader's life behind bars, including limited interactions, deteriorating health, and ongoing monitoring, provides a lens through which experts examine the intersection of criminal justice and mental health. Debates continue regarding the ethics of lifelong incarceration, the potential for remorse, and the responsibilities of society to balance accountability with humane treatment. In Wichita and beyond, the shadow of BTK has fostered a culture of vigilance. Communities that once trusted neighbors implicitly now maintain heightened awareness, and local law enforcement agencies emphasize preventative measures alongside reactive investigation. Educational programs, public safety campaigns, and collaborations between law enforcement and mental health professionals draw directly from the lessons of Rader's crimes, demonstrating how even decades-old cases can continue to shape contemporary practices. Rader's story, while unique in its extremity, also speaks to broader human themes: the tension between appearance and reality, the consequences of deception, and the fragility of safety when trust is exploited. His life and crimes serve as a reminder that violence can lurk in familiar forms, that ordinary people can conceal extraordinary threats, and that vigilance and awareness are critical components of community security. Researchers continue to study not only the crimes themselves but also the societal, psychological, and procedural contexts that enabled them. For students of criminology, law enforcement, and forensic psychology, the BTK case remains a seminal example of the intersection between human behavior, criminal opportunity, and investigative strategy. It demonstrates how long-term planning, manipulation, and the exploitation of trust can allow a single individual to commit multiple murders while evading detection. Moreover, it underscores the importance of persistence, interdisciplinary collaboration, and advances in technology in resolving even the most elusive cases. Even now, decades removed from his last confirmed killing, Dennis Rader's presence in discussions about crime is profound. Scholars continue to examine his motivations, methods, and manipulative strategies, while families of victims work to process their grief and advocate for justice. Law enforcement agencies use his case to inform policy, training, and investigative approaches, ensuring that the lessons learned from BTK's crimes are not forgotten. His name, notorious as it is, serves as a touchstone for understanding the complexities of human behavior, the dangers of complacency, and the enduring impact of violent crime. As the 21st century progresses, new generations encounter the story of Dennis Rader, whether through documentaries, articles, or criminal psychology studies. Each retelling offers an opportunity to reflect on the importance of vigilance, the consequences of unchecked narcissism and manipulation, and the necessity of integrating psychological insight into criminal investigations. In this way, the legacy of BTK extends far beyond the specifics of his crimes, shaping both professional practice and public understanding of the nature of predatory behavior. Ultimately, while Dennis Rader's physical actions ceased with his arrest, the implications of his life continue to resonate. His ability to conceal evil within the ordinary, his manipulation of social and investigative structures, and his enduring influence on law enforcement and psychological profiling illustrate the multifaceted lessons embedded in his story. The fear he instilled, the lives he affected, and the cultural and investigative